Hi, welcome to another issue of On Landscape. We're looking at Photoshop techniques and in particular luminosity masking this issue. We've looked at masks before, but a brief recap. Masks are normally created when you add an adjustment layer. If we look here, we can see that our curves adjustment has a blank white area associated with it, and white means to pass through the effect, so the effect's being passed through here. And if I click on the effect and I've got these square corners, I can apply adjustments to it. So if I invert that layer, the adjustment now doesn't get applied. And if I go back and invert it, it does get applied, and I can paint into this. We've covered this before. I can make get rid of an effect in the center of a picture, and you can see this reflected in the mask. Now, luminosity masks. The idea behind a luminosity mask is that, as before, we have a mask associated with an adjustment, but the mask is the luminosity of the picture. Now, the easiest way to explain that is to show it. So, if we go to the Channels tab here, right at the bottom there is a dotted circle. And that dotted circle says load channel as selection. And at the moment I've got the RGB channel loaded, so if I click the circle, we see what I now have a selection, and the selection is all of the bright parts of the picture. So the white parts of the picture are 100% selected, and the black parts of the picture are 0% selected, and everywhere in between, so mid-grey is 50% selected. If I now go and add a curve adjustment, or any other adjustment for that matter, we can see that my mask now looks like a black and white version of my picture. And if we alt click on it, we can see it's exactly what it looks like. Now, what does this mean? Well, it means if I apply an adjustment now, any adjustment that I apply only gets applied to the bright parts of the picture. And it gets applied half strength to the mid-grey or mid-brightness parts of the picture. So let's reduce the brightness here. And that should only be affecting the brightest half of the picture. Now, a fun thing to do is to click on the mask and invert it using Control-I or Apple-I. And what I can do now is I can apply an adjustment, and it only gets applied to the darker parts of the picture. Now, you could achieve this just with a curves adjustment, because I could apply a curve, I could lock the top half of the curve like that there, and I could apply the adjustment just to the bottom half of the picture and create a very similar effect. Sometimes it's easier to do with masks than it is with curves. But there we go. However, if we do want to apply an adjustment such as a color adjustment, let's load the mask as selection, and now we're going to apply what should we apply? Let's apply a hue saturation layer. The mask is there as before, but we can now increase the saturation in the brightest parts of the picture, or decrease the saturation in the brightest parts of the picture. And we can invert the selection again to change the saturation in the lowest parts of the picture. Now, this is all fine, but there are lots of things we can do with masks. They are quite cool. So let's start again. We're looking at this picture and we'd like to be able to lift the dark areas. The contrast range here was quite massive. We were under a rainstorm, and this is above Kinloch 11, and the sun was setting in the distance. And it's somewhere I've been quite a few times with my wife, and every time we take a walk up there I take a quick shot as a memento. So let's go and make our luminosity mask selection, and we're going to apply it using a curve. Now, we want to lift the shadows, so we're going to invert the mask. Now, if we apply a boost now, effectively we end up reducing the overall contrast of the picture. This is just like applying a curve to the bottom half as we showed before. One of the tricks we can do though is to blur the mask. So let's put that boost on again, click on the mask, and we're going to go to Filter, Blur, Gaussian Blur. Now to begin with, we'll have hardly any blur on, and we can see as I apply blur, I'm starting to get a little halo around some of the dark areas of the picture. And that's because before only the dark areas were selected. As I blur the mask, the adjustment is now spreading. So where the adjustment is trying to raise a dark area, it's also lifting the brightness of the area around the dark area. Now when the radius is only about 60 pixels, it can look like a halo. This is like a shadow highlight tool, and it's exactly what you see with a shadow highlight tool. And what you want to do with a shadow highlight tool is to create a large radius. So we'll now put it on the the widest radius, and I'm going to click OK there. If we look at the mask again now, we can see that we've spread out our mask quite considerably. So if I go back to the picture, and if I put a lot of adjustment on, you can see that, okay, it hasn't affected the brightest area, but that mask now looks like it's mostly white. Everywhere is being affected to a certain extent. Don't forget that we can make adjustments to the mask itself. So if I now apply a curve using Apple M or Control M to that mask, I can lift up the black point, and because I don't want to affect the sky, now most of this is all sky, I can lift the black point until none of the sky is affected. Now if I click OK on that, and then go and look at the picture again, we can see that my adjustment now is only affecting that bottom half of the picture. Now I can play around with the shape of the curve again to make sure this transition, because as I applied a radical change there, we can see my selection showing up. But if I soften the curve a little bit, I can fix most of that graduation. And what I've done by blurring the mask is to raise the brightness of areas that have lots of dark in them. Now it isn't just raising the areas of darkness, it's performing a change very much like shadow highlight. And this, I find, is one of the best ways of rebalancing a picture. And if I go back a few steps, let's go back to where we had the basic luminosity mask. Oops, I want to go back to, there we go. So this is where we had, before we applied the curves adjustment to the mask itself. Now what I'm going to do is apply that curves adjustment to the mask so you can see it gradually removing the effect from the sky. And using this, you can make your own selection of where this happens, and you can also affect the curve by applying a curve adjustment to that area as well. So there's lots of ways to play around with this, and obviously you also have the radius of the blur that you've applied to the picture to change as well. Now, luminosity masks can be used for other techniques as well. So for instance, we'll take a look at this edge here. Now quite often I'm going to make a change to this layer to show an extreme case of what we're trying to achieve. Now quite often we want to be able to apply an adjustment only to the bright side of this sky. Only to the dark side of this mountain. So we want to lift the brightness of the mountain without creating a halo in the sky and without raising the brightness of the sky. Now quite often we'll do this by creating a selection, and we'll go around the edge of this mountain very carefully. Well, I'm not doing it very carefully here, but you get the idea. Another way of doing this is by looking at our channels and looking at the contrast of the channels and picking one that has the best contrast. Now we look at the red channel here, and I think the red channel has the highest contrast between the mountain and the sky. We can now load that channel as a selection, as we showed before, and we can now apply that as a curves adjustment. Now if we look at the mask we've just created, we can see that it's what we expected. It's a luminosity mask. But because we can apply curves adjustments to this luminosity mask, I can open up the direct curve adjustment tool, and I can make the base layer darker until I've only got the sky selected. And then I'm going to make the sky brighter. This takes a little bit of fiddling with, but I'm going to see how close I can get. You can see we're getting some bleed here, so I'm trying to make the sky darker here, but I'm getting some bleed into this area of the picture. So we don't have to do this all in one step. Let's find an area where we're getting close. And the other thing we can do with our mask now is we don't have to apply an adjustment to the whole of the mask in one go. We can choose this area here and apply a curve adjustment just to that area. So there we go, we've fixed that transition there, and now we can go and select the other area that was causing us problems with a global change. And we can fix that area there. And we can do the same thing again. We can now go and select that corner, go into the curves change, and we can now select the little bit of mountain here. Now, what I've got there is a mask that selects just the sky. Let's invert that for a second. Now we have a mask that just selects the mountain, and we can now just raise the brightness of that mountain. So we can create quite accurate selections around complex edges. I mean, there is a bit of a bleed around there, but it's easier to fix that bleed than it is to go and make a manual selection around the whole of that area. I hope that helps as a quick introduction to masks. Hopefully in a future issue we will raise a real world example again and go through using some of the techniques we've just applied, but in a real world situation. Thank you very much.